They say you can't take it with you when you go, but nobody tells you that the people waiting for you to leave will start fighting over it before you're even gone. The air in the master bedroom of my Greenwich estate is scrubbed so clean it burns my nostrils. It smells of nothing, not of life, not of the sea breeze that used to blow in from the sound, not of the expensive leather of my favorite armchair. It smells of HEPA filters, rubbing alcohol, and the slow, oxidizing scent of a dying man. I am Charles Abernathy. I am 84 years old. I have $10 million in liquid assets, a portfolio of commercial real estate that spans 3 states, and a body that has decided to systematically shut down like a factory going out of business. I am lying in a hospital bed that costs more than my first car, staring at a ceiling painted with a fresco of clouds that I commissioned 30 years ago. Back then, I thought it was elegant. Now, it just looks like a bad joke. The clouds are fake, the sky is plaster, and I am trapped beneath them, pinned down by stage 4 pancreatic cancer that is eating me from the inside out with a hunger I used to reserve for hostile takeovers. My world has shrunk. It used to be boardrooms in Manhattan and job sites in Jersey. Now it is the 4 walls of this room, the rhythmic beeping of the vitals monitor that counts down the seconds of my remaining life, and the utter, crushing humiliation of my own biology. I shifted my weight, wincing as the pain flared in my abdomen. It's a sharp, twisting pain, like a knot being pulled tight. I looked at the digital clock on the bedside table. 2:03 p.m. They were late. My children, Richard and Vanessa, treat their weekly visits like a board meeting they can't wait to adjourn. They come every Tuesday at 2 p.m., sit for exactly 30 minutes, and leave at 2:30 p.m. so they can beat the traffic back to the city. The door creaked open. Richard's voice was too loud for the hushed room. He walked in, bringing a gust of cold air and expensive cologne with him. I blinked. It was the only greeting I could manage. My throat was dry, parched from the medication that kept me lucid but immobile. "He's awake," Vanessa said, stepping out from behind her brother. She was wearing a coat that probably cost $5,000, and she didn't take it off. She never takes it off. It's a subtle signal. She isn't staying long enough to get comfortable. They pulled the 2 wingback chairs from the corner of the room. They didn't pull them close to the bed. They positioned them near the window, as far away from me as possible while still technically being in the room. They sat down, creating a buffer zone of expensive Persian rug between us. "You look stable," Richard said, checking his phone. He put it away, then pulled it out again 3 seconds later. "I talked to Dr. Evans downstairs. He says your numbers are plateauing. That's good, right?" "It means I'm not dying fast enough for your schedule," I thought, but I just nodded weakly. "We need to talk about the trust, Dad," Richard continued, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "The tech startup I told you about, the liquidity round is closing on Friday. If we can release some of the equity from the bond portfolio now, I can get in on the ground floor. It's a sure thing, AI-driven logistics." I looked at him, my son, 50 years old and still chasing the next big thing because he never had the patience to build the first big thing. He was already borrowing against his inheritance in his head. He looked at me not as a father, but as a stubborn vault that refused to open. "And the house," Vanessa chimed in, looking around the room with a critical eye. She pulled a tape measure from her purse. "I brought the contractor by earlier. He waited in the hall. He says if we want top dollar next spring, we need to gut the kitchen. Open concept." Next spring? I would be dead by next spring. They knew it. I knew it. But hearing her plan the renovation while I was still breathing the air in the room felt like a physical slap. She wasn't just planning for my death. She was impatient for it. She was already mentally knocking down walls. "The marble is dated," Vanessa muttered, making a note on her phone. I tried to speak. I wanted to tell them that I built this house for their mother. I wanted to tell them that the kitchen was closed off because she liked to cook in peace, away from the noise of the parties we used to throw. But the effort was too much. The pain in my stomach cramped, a sudden violent spasm that made my toes curl. And then the inevitable happened. The one thing I feared more than death. The one thing that strips a man of his armor and leaves him naked and shivering in the cold light of reality. I lost control. It wasn't a choice. It was a failure of the system. My body, weakened and ravaged, simply let go. The sensation was immediate, hot, and horrifying, and the smell followed instantly, sharp, biological, and undeniable. It filled the space between us, bridging the gap across the Persian rug. Richard stopped talking mid-sentence. He froze. His nose wrinkled. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and covered his face, his expression twisting into undisguised revulsion. "Jesus, Dad," he muttered, his voice muffled by the silk. He stood up, backing away toward the door as if I were radioactive. "Can't you control yourself?" I looked at him. I looked for concern. I looked for the son who used to cry when he scraped his knee, the boy I had carried on my shoulders. I saw only disgust. I saw a man offended by the inconvenience of my mortality. I looked at Vanessa. She didn't even look at me. She stood up, checking her watch, smoothing the front of her coat. She held her breath, her face tight. "I'll get the help," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We can't stay in here with this atmosphere. It's a health hazard, Richard." "Unbelievable," Richard said, shaking his head. "I'm trying to talk business and he—" They walked out. They didn't call the nurse immediately. I heard them in the hallway. Richard asked. "No," Vanessa replied. "We'll tell the maid on the way out." Their footsteps faded. I lay there in the silence, lying in my own filth, the shame burning my eyes hotter than the tears. I was Charles Abernathy. I had commanded thousands of men. I had shaped the skyline of this city. And now I was a leaking asset, left to rot because my children couldn't stomach the reality of who I had become. I closed my eyes, praying for the end, praying for the darkness to come and take me so I wouldn't have to feel this stinging indignity for 1 second longer. Then the door opened again. It wasn't my children. It wasn't the high-priced private nurse agency staff who wore uniforms and looked at the clock. It was Maria. Maria is 28 years old. She is small, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that look like they have worked every day of her life. She is a nurse aide, one of the night staff who picks up extra shifts during the day to send money back to her family in the Philippines. She smells of cheap soap and kindness. She walked into the room. The smell hit her. I saw her pause, but only for a fraction of a second. She didn't cover her nose. She didn't wince. She didn't look away. She looked straight at me. Her eyes were brown and deep, and they were filled with a compassion that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. "It's okay, Mr. Charles," she whispered. She walked straight to the bed. She lowered the side rail with a gentle click. She placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me, telling me without words that I was still a person. "I'm sorry," I wheezed, the tears finally spilling over, tracking hot paths into my ears. "Shh," she soothed, pulling the fresh linens from the cart she had brought in. "Don't be sorry. It's just a body. Bodies do things. It happens to the best of us. Let's get you fresh." She worked with a practiced, respectful efficiency. She turned me, her strength surprising for her size. She cleaned me. It was dirty work. It was heavy work. It was the kind of work that my son, with his soft hands and silk handkerchief, would rather die than do. But Maria did it with grace. She talked to me the whole time, not about the mess, but about the world outside. "The cardinals are back in the feeder today, Mr. Charles," she said, wiping my skin with a warm cloth. "I saw a bright red one. He looked very bossy." She smiled. It was a real smile. She changed the sheets with me still in the bed, rolling me gently from side to side. She put a fresh gown on me. She adjusted the pillows until my head was perfectly supported. She opened the window just a crack to let the fresh air in, clearing the scent of my shame. I looked at her. She was smoothing the blanket over my chest, her movements tender. As I lay there, watching this young woman perform the most intimate, degrading task imaginable with a grace my own children couldn't summon if their lives depended on it, I realized something profound. It hit me harder than the diagnosis ever did. Love isn't about who inherits your name. It isn't about who shares your DNA. Love is about who cleans you when you can't clean yourself. Love is about who stays in the room when the air turns foul. If you have ever felt the sting of family who only loves you when you're strong, or if you have ever wondered who will be there when the lights go out, take a moment to subscribe. Because I am about to show you that the most expensive things in life, dignity, care, and loyalty, cannot be bought, but they can be rewarded. And sometimes the only way to teach the ungrateful the value of what they have is to take it all away. "There," Maria said, patting my hand. "Good as new. Are you comfortable, mister?" "Yes," I whispered. "You rest now," she said. She left the room to go to the kitchen. 5 minutes later, my children returned. They walked in cautiously, sniffing the air like bloodhounds. When they realized the room was clean, they relaxed. They sat back down in their chairs by the window, picking up the conversation exactly where they had left off, as if the last 20 minutes hadn't happened. As if I hadn't been dismantled and rebuilt by a stranger while they waited in the hall. "So, the estate tax," Richard said, tapping his phone. "We need to make sure the trust is liquid, Dad. We don't want to have to sell the portfolio in a down market to cover the IRS bill. And the furniture," Vanessa added. "Most of this heavy Victorian stuff needs to go. We should call an auction house now, get it appraised so we can move it the week after the funeral." I looked at them. I looked at Richard's manicured hands, hands that had never held a shovel, never wiped a brow, never cleaned a father. I looked at Vanessa's cold eyes, calculating the square footage of my deathbed. And then I looked at the door, where Maria was standing quietly in the shadows, holding a cup of ice chips, waiting for them to stop talking so she could feed me. She was humming a lullaby under her breath, a soft, tuneless sound that was the only real thing in the entire house. They saw a dying man. They saw a leaking asset. They saw a payday. Maria saw Charles. I closed my eyes. The pain in my stomach was there, but it was distant now. It was overshadowed by a new feeling, a cold, hard clarity. I listened to them bicker about market caps and paint swatches for another 10 minutes before they checked their watches in unison. "Well, traffic," Richard said, standing up. "We should go. Hang in there, Dad." "Bye, Daddy," Vanessa said. She didn't kiss me. She waved from the doorway. They left. Maria came to the bedside. She fed me the ice chips, one by one, letting them melt on my tongue. "They are busy people," she said softly, trying to make excuses for them, trying to protect my feelings. "They love you, Mr. Charles." "No, Maria," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "It isn't hard for them." Night fell. The house grew quiet. The staff changed shifts, but Maria stayed. She sat in the corner, knitting under the light of a small lamp. "Maria," I rasped. She was at my side in an instant. "Yes?" "No," I said. "It's late, Mr. Charles. Hand me the phone, Maria, and find the number for Mr. Sterling." She hesitated. "It's not too late," I replied, my eyes locking on to hers. She dialed the number and held the phone to my ear. Sterling answered on the second ring. He was an old shark, a man who slept 3 hours a night and billed for 25. He was loyal to 2 things, the billable hour and me. His voice was gravelly. "No, Arthur, it's not. I need you to come over. Now? I don't have much time, Arthur. Bring the notepad. Bring the seal. Sterling arrived 40 minutes later. He looked disheveled but alert. He sat by my bed, his pen hovering over the yellow legal pad. He asked, "You want to change the percentages?" "I want to give them exactly what they gave me," I whispered. I dictated the terms. I laid out the assets, the 10 million, the houses, the stocks. And then I gave him the specific instruction. "I want you to stop at the 24-hour grocery store on your way home, Arthur," I said. Sterling looked at me like I was hallucinating. "Yes, I want you to buy a box of tissues, the cheapest, most generic brand you can find. Because that is their inheritance," I said. "Put it in the will, a specific bequest to Richard and Vanessa." Sterling asked, his hand pausing. "This will cause a war. They will contest it. They will drag your name through the mud." I looked at the door where Maria had stepped out to give us privacy. I thought about the smell of the room hours ago. I thought about the silk handkerchief covering Richard's nose. "Let it burn," I whispered, closing my eyes. "They wanted my money. They can have the only thing they offered me when I was dying." Sterling wrote. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the sound of justice being served, one line at a time. I listened to it, and for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The books were balanced. They say that at your own funeral, you are the only person who doesn't have to worry about what to wear. But as I look down from whatever vantage point the universe grants to the newly departed, I realized I should have worried about what my children were wearing. I died on a Thursday morning, quietly, just as the sun hit the east window. Maria was holding my hand. My children were at a brunch in Manhattan. The funeral was 3 days later, and it was exactly the kind of ostentatious, hollow spectacle I had explicitly told them I didn't want. It was a production. A stage play of grief performed by people who had checked their watches while I was taking my last breaths. The casket was mahogany with gold rails, gaudy, expensive, and utterly pointless for a man going into the dirt. Richard stood at the podium, wearing a suit that cost more than Maria made in a year. He held a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hand, not from emotion, but from the caffeine jitters of a man leveraged to his eyeballs. "My father was a titan," Richard read, his voice projecting a practice solemnly that made my spirit gag. "He built an empire from stone and steel. He taught us the value of hard work." It was a lie so bold it almost cracked the stained glass windows. He hadn't written it. I could hear the cadence of artificial intelligence in the phrasing, the generic platitudes about legacy and industry that could have applied to any rich old man in the tri-state area. He didn't share a single memory. He didn't talk about the time I taught him to fish or the time we built the treehouse. He talked about my net worth without mentioning a dollar sign. Vanessa sat in the front pew, her face hidden behind a veil of black lace that was more fashion statement than mourning attire. When the camera from the local business journal panned toward her, she squeezed out a single crystalline tear. She dabbed it away instantly, careful not to smudge her foundation. It was a performance worthy of an award, provided that award was for narcissism. But the real insult came at the graveside. As the workers lowered my body into the ground, the final dull thud of earth hitting wood echoing in the silence, my children didn't throw flowers. They stepped back, huddling together near the black limousine, their voices hushed but carrying on the wind. "I'm taking the Hamptons house, Richard," Vanessa hissed, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "I've already spoken to the broker." "You can't afford the property taxes on the Hamptons house," Richard snapped back, keeping his voice low but venomous. "Besides, I need the equity. I'm liquidating the Greenwich estate immediately." "You are not liquidating the estate," she countered. "That's the crown jewel. We split the portfolio. You take the stocks, I take the real estate." Richard scoffed. "I'm the executor. Or I will be as soon as Sterling reads the will. They were carving up the carcass before the soil had even settled. They stood 10 feet from my open grave, arguing about liquidity and rental markets, oblivious to the fact that the man they were burying had anticipated every single word of their conversation. The reading of the will took place the following Monday. The atmosphere in the library of my Greenwich estate was heavy, smelling of old paper, lemon polish, and naked greed. It was a room I had loved, lined with books I had actually read, unlike my children, who viewed them as decorative acoustic dampeners. Richard and Vanessa sat on the Chesterfield leather sofa. They looked solemn, dressed in respectful dark tones, but the air around them vibrated with a frenetic anticipation. They had brought their spouses, Richard's wife, who was currently pricing the rug with her eyes, and Vanessa's husband, a silent man who looked like he was mentally spending his share on a new boat. Richard checked his phone every 30 seconds. He was watching the stock market. He was watching his future unfold in green percentages. And then there was Maria. She sat in a straight-backed wooden chair in the far corner, near the door, as if she expected to be asked to leave at any moment. She was wearing a simple black dress, the fabric worn but clean. Her hands were folded in her lap, clutching a rosary. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. She wasn't looking at the furniture. She wasn't looking at the accounts. She was looking at the empty space behind my desk where I used to sit. She was mourning the man, not the loss of the ATM. Mr. Sterling entered the room at exactly 10 a.m. He was a man of punctuality and stone. He carried his leather briefcase like a weapon. He sat behind my massive oak desk, taking the seat of power without hesitation. He opened the briefcase. The snap of the latches sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. Richard cleared his throat. "Let's get this started, Arthur. We have a lot of administration to handle today." Sterling didn't look up. He arranged his papers with meticulous slowness. "We will proceed according to Mr. Abernathy's instructions," Sterling said, his voice a gravelly baritone that brokered no argument. Richard's eyes flicked to the corner of the room. He frowned, his brow furrowing as if he had just noticed a stain on the upholstery. "This?" Richard asked, pointing a manicured finger at Maria. "This is a private family matter, Arthur. Cut her a check for her hours, give her a nice tip, and send her home." Maria flinched. She started to stand up, her head bowed. "I'm sorry, I should go." "Sit down, Miss Gonzalez," Sterling commanded. He didn't raise his voice, but Maria froze and sat back down. Sterling looked at Richard over the rim of his reading glasses. "She is a named beneficiary in the instrument." Richard scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. He leaned back, crossing his legs. "Fine. Dad probably left her $5,000. Sentimental old fool." "Yes," Vanessa said, checking her manicure. Sterling opened the leather binder. He didn't start with the distribution of the real estate. He didn't start with the stock portfolio. He reached under the desk, into a shopping bag he had placed there earlier, and pulled out a small, square cardboard box wrapped in shiny silver paper. He placed it in the center of the desk. "First," Sterling announced, "Mr. Abernathy left a specific, personal bequest to his children, Richard and Vanessa. He instructed that you open this before we proceed to the residual estate." Richard sat up straighter. A greedy glint entered his eyes. "Personal bequest? Jewelry? Maybe Mom's diamonds," Vanessa whispered, leaning forward. Richard stood up. He walked to the desk and grabbed the box. It was light. He frowned, shaking it slightly. It rattled softly. "Open it," Sterling said. Richard tore the paper off. He ripped the cardboard tab. He opened the lid. He stared into the box. He reached in and pulled out the contents. It wasn't a watch. It wasn't a diamond necklace. It was a box of facial tissues. Generic, store brand, the kind that feels like sandpaper against the skin. The kind I had told Sterling to buy at the 24-hour grocer. Richard held the box of tissues, looking at it as if it were a bomb. "What?" Vanessa stood up, peering over his shoulder. Tissues? Is this a joke? Richard shook the box. Nothing rattled. It was just tissues. There is a note, Sterling said. He picked up a small cream-colored card from the desk and held it up. In Mr. Read it, Richard demanded, his face flushing a dark, angry red. Sterling cleared his throat. He read the words I had dictated to him on my deathbed, his voice carrying the full weight of my final judgment. For your crocodile tears. You didn't cry when I was sick. You didn't cry when I was lonely. You certainly won't cry for me now. But you might cry for what comes next. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, the air sucked out by the vacuum of their shock. "This is insane," Richard whispered. Then he shouted, throwing the box of tissues onto the floor. "This is senile garbage! He was out of his mind!" "He was perfectly lucid," Sterling countered, his voice cold. Vanessa shrieked, her composure shattering. "Stop playing games, Arthur! The accounts, the property!" Sterling looked at them. He looked at the box of tissues lying on the expensive Persian rug. He looked at Maria, who was trembling in the corner, her hands covering her mouth. "Very well," Sterling said. He adjusted his glasses. He turned the page of the binder. He looked up, locking eyes with Richard. He paused. He let the words hang there. He pointed a finger toward the corner of the room. For a second, nobody moved. The words were too big, too impossible to process. Then the room exploded. Richard jumped to his feet, kicking the coffee cable over. A crystal vase shattered against the fireplace. "Ugh!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "That's impossible! She's a maid! She's a nobody! You forged this, Sterling!" Vanessa began to scream, a high, piercing sound of pure hysteria. "She manipulated him! She drugged him! She's a predator! We'll sue! We'll contest this in probate!" She turned on Maria, her eyes wild. Maria shrank back into the chair, sobbing, terrified. "You can try," Sterling said. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. But Mr. Abernathy anticipated this reaction. Sterling placed the tablet on the desk, facing the sofa. He pressed play. My face filled the screen. It was a video recorded 3 nights before I died. I looked frail. My skin was gray, my eyes sunken. But my voice was steady. It was the voice of the man who had built skyscrapers. "My name is Charles Abernathy," the video me said. "I am recording this statement to certify my capacity and my intent. I know exactly what day it is. I know exactly how much I am worth." Richard stopped screaming. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hook. "My children wanted my legacy," the video continued. "But they couldn't handle my reality. They wanted the money, but they didn't want the smell." On the screen, I leaned closer to the camera lens. "Richard, Vanessa, do you remember last Tuesday, the day I had an accident?" I saw Richard flinch. I saw the memory hit him. "You walked out," I said from the grave. "You covered your nose with a silk handkerchief because the smell of your dying father offended you. You left me lying in my own filth because it was inconvenient." My eyes on the screen softened as I looked away from the lens, presumably at Maria, who was holding the camera. Maria didn't leave. She cleaned me. She fed me. She held my hand when the pain was too much. She loved the man, not the money. The video ended. The screen went black. Richard stood there, frozen. He looked at the tablet, he looked at Sterling, and finally, he looked at Maria. Maria was crying. Real, heaving sobs of shock and grief rocked her small body. She wasn't crying for the money. She wasn't calculating the net worth. She was crying because I had defended her. She was crying because someone had finally seen her. Richard stammered. "This is undue influence. She was the caregiver. It's a conflict of interest. I have the affidavit from Dr. Evans certifying Charles's mental state, Sterling said, closing the binder with a snap. I have the logs of your visits, all 30 minutes a week. I have the testimony of the household staff regarding your behavior. And I have this video. If you contest this, Richard, I will play this video on the 6 o'clock news. Sterling leaned forward. Do you really want your investors to see that, Richard? Richard went pale. He knew his reputation was the only thing keeping his house of cards standing. Get out, Sterling said. This is Ms. Gonzalez's house now. You can't do this, Vanessa whispered, sinking onto the sofa, realizing her kitchen renovation was never going to happen. Daddy just did, Sterling said. Security is waiting in the hall. Richard straightened his jacket. He tried to summon some shred of dignity, but it was gone. He looked at me, or where I used to sit, with hatred. This isn't over, he hissed. You were his biological beneficiary, Sterling corrected, but you were never his son. A son protects his father. Richard turned and stormed out. Vanessa followed him, weeping into her hands. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing the silence in the room. They were gone. Sterling let out a long sigh. He walked around the desk. He approached Maria, who was still huddled in the chair, clutching her rosary. Ms. Gonzalez, he said gently. She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. I don't want it, she whispered. I don't want the money. It's too much trouble. They will hate me. Please, Mr. Sterling knelt in front of her. He took the deed from the folder and placed it in her rough, work-worn hands. He knew you would say that, Sterling said softly. That's exactly why he gave it to you, she asked, tears streaming down her face. He wanted you to know that when everyone else saw a dying old man, you saw a human being. You gave him back his dignity in his final days. To him, that was worth more than $10 million. Maria held the paper to her chest. She bowed her head and wept, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. Outside, through the thick glass of the library windows, I could hear the aggressive roar of engines. I watched from my vantage point as my children got into their leased luxury cars, the cars they could no longer afford. They peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying, fleeing the scene of their defeat. They left behind the house. They left behind the money. They left behind the legacy. The only thing they took with them was a box of generic tissues. And as I watched them drive away, I knew they would need every single one of them. Not to cry for me, but to cry for themselves. The books were balanced. The debt was paid. And finally, the air in the room smelled clean.